Well, hi, my name is Keith Wright, and I am a financial professional with Thrivent Financial. And I am thrilled today to be able to promote two of my very good friends. So first of all, Pete Turner. Pete I've known for about 35, 40 years. He was what I call a kid in my youth group when I was a youth pastor in Walnut Creek, California, back in the mid-1980s. And we had a lot of fun, a lot of memorable experiences, and built actually lifetime memories that every time people from the youth group are together, we just tell stories and remember what a special time that was in that group. And a lot of that had to do with the culture that was built in the youth group. It was a culture of fun and of adventure and of deep and meaningful relationships and of caring for one another and caring for the world around us. So just really thrilled about Pete coming up on his 1000th episode of the Break It Down show. Absolutely amazing that he sits out here in his yurt day by day and records very interesting cultural conversations that help us all think more deeply and more completely about the things that are going on in our world. And so when I was thinking about Pete and his podcast, I thought immediately of my friend Lisa Jackson. Lisa is the founder and the president of Corporate Culture Pros. And for about the last 22 years, Lisa has been working with Fortune 100 companies, helping them not only to think about their profitability, but about creating world-class cultures where people want to work at these companies and want to make a difference through their work. And does some very unique work around that. More recently, Lisa has been working in the field of mergers and acquisitions. So a lot of times two companies may come together and the companies do a lot of great due diligence around the financials of the two companies coming together, but they don't often think about the type of culture that they like to see emerge with two corporate entities coming together. And Lisa is an expert of helping corporate executives envision what they want to bring about culturally for their companies. So I'm thrilled today to be able to promote Lisa and introduce her to Pete and have her be interviewed on this podcast of the Break It Down show. Going back to what I do as a financial advisor with Thrivent Financial, one of the reasons I joined Thrivent 4.5 years ago was because they have a very unique culture. At Thrivent, we believe that money is not a goal, but it's a tool to help us accomplish our dreams and goals as a family, as individuals, and also to give back to our families and to our communities. And so one of the things that is really a hallmark of the culture at Thrivent Financial is our generosity program. So we actually are a not-for-profit organization and give away in the neighborhood of $330 million a year in seed money to help our members, our investors, lean into the charities of their choice to do community service projects, to promote fundraisers, and to give back to meaningful charities in the communities that we serve. And so I'd like to just encourage anybody that is looking for a financial advisor, a financial professional, to look at Thrivent. It's a way not only to get great returns on your investments and to protect yourself against the setbacks that might come along in life through insurance products, but also to look at our generosity programs and ways to give back to the charities that are most meaningful to you. So I'm going to turn it over to Pete and to Lisa now, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity to introduce the two of them to each other and to you.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Ames.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, this is Lisa Jackson, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
This is a red letter day for me. I've been trying to get Keith Wright on the show forever. Here I am not introducing the guest first, but I just wanted to say Keith is co-hosting with me. Keith has known me as long as anybody has. And he's like, hey, you got to have Lisa Jackson on the show. She's awesome. And so Keith, tell us why we have Lisa on the show.
Well, Lisa
is the premier speaker and consultant on all matters of corporate culture. Written a couple books, been in the consulting industry for about 20 plus years, and has worked with Fortune 100 companies, and just has a lot of great insights into corporate culture and why culture matters, and how companies and organizations can really attend to their culture in very meaningful ways that are going to bring about growth and better satisfaction among the workforce. So just thought that she'd be a great person for you to interview, Pete, and provide a lot of her insights.
I love it. Yeah, everybody who knows me knows that I know quite a bit about culture because it kept me alive overseas and everything. So it's always great to meet a fellow culture wonk and talk about this thing. Tell us, what is culture to you, Lisa?
Yeah. I should read the back of the yogurt container because I think that's going to be a better definition than anything.
Seriously.
You can help me out here. What is culture? No.
I found out, but this is the thing, is that people don't realize how hard of a question that is. And if you were to ask 100 people, you would literally get 5,000 answers. I had one, this taking Lisa off the hook a little bit. One time someone said, I hate living in Las Vegas. There's no culture here. And I said, okay, what's culture? And she said, there's no grass. Okay. I mean,
all
she's
right.
not wrong, but that's not a very comprehensive definition.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, especially now, because you've had like 90% of the organizational life has gone remote and is doing work this way. And I've been asking that question myself of what is culture in a remote work world, where you're sitting in your sweatpants and you're, casting yourself out on Zoom and you're sitting in meetings that don't have real people in the room. And, I think that, to me, I look at it differently. So there's a lot of definitions around the corporate version of culture, which is just how we get things done around here. But that seems pretty trite. And I feel that what it really boils down to is how you make people feel like they want to be there. And that's the modern definition of culture, because when I graduated college and started my career, you were just so happy to have a paycheck. And that was the mentality then. And you've got a whole generation of people now that think differently. I heard you talking about the just millennial generation. Oftentimes, even applying for a job is an arduous task for them.
Right.
And because they'd rather just become an Instagram star, or freelance their way to happiness.
Right.
And so companies actually have to build cultures now that have grass and all kinds of other fun things that distract us from, the boringness of work.
Yeah, I know you're right about that. And I also know that when I say this, you're going to agree. Culture despises design, like it just will not tolerate. It is that to make that work is not, that's why you exist, is to help companies get that figured out. You can say you've got this fantastic culture, but the reality is something completely different.
What they're talking about outside the building, that's your culture, right? And you're right about that. I mean, it's funny that you would say that, because a lot of the clients that we've worked with have told us that our primary contribution was to reveal the real truth about what people were feeling and thinking about the culture. And, so it takes that not native to your own land is never going to be able to come into an organization and ask questions like I ask and have anybody
Right.
truth about it. I do think, but they would tell me, you helped us architect this culture journey. And I would just sort of smile and smirk a little bit, because you're right. It actually has to be more organic than contrived. And I think that so much of the time people think the culture is the posters on the wall. It's the mission statement that we tout in our meetings. And, that really has very little to do with whether or not people want to show up to work in your company and stay there. Kind of has to do with whether I really like my boss. I mean, it sort of just comes down to that in the end. And
yeah, this is true. The all of the things you just said, I have 100 things to say about, because we've done this kind of cultural job. But I wanted to focus back on Keith for a second, because as kids, he's an adult barely, leader of like a youth group, and he built this youth group. I've been in other youth groups and gone to other churches and stuff, but it stuck with Keith. He built this culture where not only did I want to be there, it was okay for me to bring my friends. I was inspired to bring people, and I lived across a bridge in another part of town that, like, it wasn't far away, but culturally it was a different world, and in a different county and everything. But I brought people all the time because I was, even if they weren't like Christians at all, I'm like, these guys can come, they'll have a good time, and I want them to have fun with me. And Keith created that. Keith, how did you do that? How did you make that so powerful and palatable to so many people? Because our youth group was huge. I mean, we weren't trying to be the biggest one ever, but we had a blast.
Exactly. And I think, just kind of thinking about this conversation, it wasn't something that came about, by design or through like a strategic planning process of just do A and then B and then C, and then voila, you've got this this youth group. There's definitely some planning that went into it, but mainly it was coming back to some kind of essential values that I had as a youth leader and as a youth pastor that I was bringing into that setting. So a few of them just top of mind would be that Christianity or the youth group culture has to be a heck of a lot of fun. And so fun was like a key driver to everything that we did. And so if it wasn't fun, we weren't doing it. And so not only were the things that we did were fun, but I really had a value of just really pushing the envelope on that. Like, how can we make this even more incredibly fun, or, kind of add layers to that just to make it completely memorable and, an outstanding type experience. So that was like one part of it. Another was the value of relationships, in terms of what was the tone of those relationships. So, like you kind of alluded to, everybody was accepted. We had about 25 or 30 young adults. Like, I was in my early 20s. All the volunteer leaders in the group were all, kind of my peers in their early 20s as well. And we were intentionally building relationships with high schoolers and middle schoolers in order to, have whatever happened in that culture and that group kind of grow out of those relationships. And then, and just really just in a very accepting environment where anybody was welcome at any time and whatever was going on in their life, and that was there. So, there's probably 4 or 5 other key values as well that were a part, and it was always coming back to those values, over and over again with the leadership, and the culture just emerged out of reinforcing those values.
You made a lot of decisions that would push the parents' comfort level. I know for sure, my parents were like, "This can't happen. This isn't right." These things.
Well, your dad's line for me, he would always say, "Well, that Keith."
Yes. But the scale balanced out because I wanted to be at church more. I wanted to be involved more, and then my peers would look at me and see this leader guy, this guy that's bringing people into the group from a far off land, and so there was a balancing of that. Like, yes, I got to be wild and crazy, which I needed an outlet for, but also here I am, like, leading other, peers and going to church willingly all the time because it was a blast for me to be at like, Lisa, that is like an ideal for building, a fantastic culture, to have people excited to go do something that their parents want them desperately to do, but at the cost of also, hey, we're going to let these kids run a little bit crazy.
I think that's pretty much the formula. Keith, said it really well about the coming back to the leadership values of the people who are setting those experiences in motion. And, if I have spent countless hours in boardrooms with executives who are wordsmithing to death the value statements, and just, I always try not to roll my eyes in the middle of those exercises, but they're missing the point completely. which is really what kind of experience do you want people to have working here? And that should really not have to be wordsmith. That should come out of what Keith was saying, whether that's him deciding to eat dog food in front of out, but I'm not suggesting that leaders should do that, but they could. They probably would create a lot better culture if they thought that way, is creating fun at work. And there has been this mindset that you are here, where this is serious. We have to make money, right? We have to make profit, and we have to grow the business, and we have to make our numbers, and we have to feed the quarterly profit machine. And man, talk about sucking the joy out of work.
Yeah. And unhappy employees are expensive employees to keep around, because they're not inspired,
Where to let go.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about that? How about like the corporate model of, hey, do you have a minute? And then next thing you know, you're walking out with the cardboard box and the security around you. If you run a company, if you think for 1 second that doesn't freak people out, that you tell people that they're part of a family and that they matter to you, and then you walk them out like they're, a Green Mile walk, that is such an expensive way to terminate people. I don't know the numbers for sure, but I promise if you gave a better separation package where people were like, oh, he had to go, but we know he's taken care of, or she was taken care of. It's so easy to screw up dismissing people or cutting something so the CEO or someone gets a bonus at the end of the year, like, oh my God, you want to talk about horrible culture? Yes, your bottom line looks better, but it costs you millions of dollars that you can't even see.
Yeah, that's so real. And that exercise around the layoffs, and, so you're describing kind of the person, the Uncle Joe that nobody really wants around, and somebody finally has the courage to fire him. Because he's not doing anything and he's collecting a huge paycheck and sitting in an office, that dynamic is one piece of it. But the other is the annual reorg, where that happens en masse, right? So the organization is walking people out, and oftentimes nothing is said about it. And it's just crazy to me. It's like everybody just acts as though the whole thing was if it didn't happen, and yet half your family just got wiped out, as you pointed out. It's crazy. Any other context in life, you would think that is crazy.
Yeah.
So I think eliminating corporate culture is really the goal that I have, and the mission I'm on is, getting it to be much more like what you're talking about family. I mean, sometimes families can be super dysfunctional, so I'm not sure that's the perfect metaphor, but certainly creating a tribe of people who have a common bond and have that joy, to be there. And it's easier said than done, right?
Yeah, for sure. Because that message. So every CEO or a C-suite person says this is our culture and everything else. And then what folks like you and I do is we say, okay, let me go find it. And then you go out and you ask those questions, right? Like, hey, what was the last company bonus that you really thought was great? What if it was a perk, a spiff, whatever it was? And when they're like, I don't know, I won something, but I didn't go on the trip. I'm like, cool, that's great. Because the boss wants to know that, but the boss could never go find that out. Like when I worked for commanders, they would all say, I need to know the most influential person. And I'd be new to them, right? So I walk in day one in their space. I need to know the most influential man in this valley. I already know that, sir. I'm pretty good at this job. Oh, great. Who is it? It's you. And until you stop being the most influential person, none of these Afghans, none of these Iraqis can emerge as a leader. None of them can gather the people. Mm-hmm. And it drove them crazy, but didn't make it less true, and that's what I help them do, is like, do less, work within their culture, quit inventing culture for them. We always say rule of law, and rule of law is harder to define than culture. Like, what's rule of law? Because they have a system of laws that they work, and they work through a non-penal system because they don't want to pay taxes and have this enormous penal system, right? And so they deal with things up to and including murder. Sounds like rule of law to me. But you have to translate that between the two realities, the cultural realities. And so if you try to create this whole new system with courts and everything else and magistrates and all that, they understand it, but why would they use it? They have one already. And if we ignore that cultural system, whatever it is, corporate, family, whatever it is, you can't reliably get down the path that you think you're to your outcomes, right? And so you can have a corporate culture. Like our corporate culture is family and friends and making money. But if you and I can't go out and find it, that's not your corporate culture.
Yeah. That's well.
I think I think you have a good point there. And so sometimes, like when you're just reinforcing those values, you have the vision of the culture that you want to see unveil itself. I think sometimes you just have to let that, let things go, let it go on autopilot, let that culture emerge. And so a lot of times we don't allow that culture to merge organically because we're, burdening it with either dysfunctions of personality or with policies or with certain goals that were or objectives that we're kind of putting on top of that. And so it just stifles that growth. I think what you're saying, Pete, there is that, with your commanders, if they just get out of the way, then a culture would emerge. And so sometimes we get in the way of ourselves when we're, and we basically sabotage what we ultimately want because we're mucking it up with so many different things.
And I think the biggest mucking up that's so true that leaders do is they make change happen that nobody understands. So there'll be a merger, right? And there'll be this kind of grand story around the merger of how good it's going to be for the company and the party line around that. And I worked with an organization that if I mentioned their name, you'd know outright who they are. So I won't do that. But they were in somewhat related to the propane business, and they bought a company that produced barbecue tools. Right. And they were in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and they bought this company that was in Queens, New York. And the two leaders at the top of each of those two organizations were oil and water anyway. But then you've got New York and North Carolina, right? So culture, I think, Keith talks about burning it up. There's also just these natural kind of very different ways of looking at the world and experiencing the world. And in the end, I have seen, something like 70% of mergers fail. And the reason they fail is because you don't have that alignment right at the top of who owns what. And people are used to, when they've gotten to leadership positions, they're sort of used to like, I've arrived and I'm the boss. And, that mindset is definitely the burning torch for culture. It really is. It's like, if you think more flipping it to servant leadership, you're starting to get on the right track. Just what you said, Pete, care enough about the people that you're stewards of to find out what they think and what they care about. That I have said that every single way I know how to say it for 20 years, and I still find the blank stare coming back. Like, what do you mean? How are you doing?
Yeah. One of the things Americans abroad, especially in the military State Department, tend to dominate things. And they tend to always be the smartest person in the room, which is the worst way to do anything culturally.
Abroad?
Yeah. And I always tell them, don't try to out Iraq and Iraqi. Don't try to out Afghan and Afghan. It's okay to learn. Even if you already know the answer to the question, it's okay to say, how does Ramadan work again? Give them a chance to shine and then also shut up and learn something from that. Because even if you know it, you don't know it as good as you think you do. We miss these opportunities because our ego gets in the way of, and again, culture, it and ego are like antipolar or whatever. They shove away from each other. At least that's how I think about that. What are your thoughts in terms of what does ego do with culture when they get close to each other?
Yeah, it's sort of like pouring acid on a snowball. I mean, it just eliminates the juice of it and the form of it. I think, and what you're saying about that question thing, I don't want to oversimplify or be reductive about culture, but in the end, I think that is the big aha that I've seen over the years of if there was one thing that I could get leaders to do, it would be to stop talking and ask questions and then listen to the answer. And I've taught that one principle for so many years, and especially when it comes to change, which is accelerating, and there's a lot of nervousness around it. And now you've got a whole generation, really the millennial generation, the younger generations, that are asking these kind of asking for this type of leadership. And you've got the people my generation rolling their eyes and being like, they're so entitled and they want to have a say in everything that goes on around here. And I look at them and like go, who raised them? Like we can't disown an entire generation just because we're in these positions of leadership and think that we're supposed to have power over them. We raised this generation to expect more or to be heard at the dinner table. It's not the children are to be seen and not heard generation. And so there is a lot of tension, I think, in the organizational life around generations as well, that is butting up against each other in terms of the values that each of those generations holds. But the millennials are, by 2025, if not already, the majority of the workforce. 75% of the workforce by 2025 is the prediction. So who are you going to listen to?
Yeah, and then there's those crazy digital natives. They don't make any sense either.
I burn two of them. They confound me every day.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who
won't answer the phone right away.
Yeah. As somebody who professes to be a bit of a cultural expert, it's hard when it's your own lens. And that's one of the things I support is, a commander can't go and learn their own culture. They can try to design it. They can try to emulate it, but you need a Lisa or a Keith or a Pete, somebody external to say, you created these values. I can't find them. Or, I found some other values that I think you should know about, because the thing I learned from commanders is they're super smart and have tons of resources, and they can deal with the problem if you can relate it to them. So whether it's internal or external, you have to have someone that comes in with fresh eyes and says, what should I find? All right, let me go see if I can find it. And if you can find that thing, I had this great company. The guy's last name is Tuthill. They're a Midwestern company. And I had a couple of his people on because he funded a project where they flew around the world trying to find happiness in all these different people. And I heard them talk, and they were so incredible. They were so ingrained with this corporate culture. It was positive that I'm like, I've got to talk to this guy because I'm hearing all the things I don't normally hear. I don't hear anger, pain, divorce, broke, all these negative values. I heard people are like, even when you leave, we work on making sure that your path is set so that you can go do the thing you're supposed to do better. And I'm like, what on earth company is this? And I had the guy Jay on, and he's like, yeah, my dad was a World War II veteran, command and control kind of guy. And I said, I'm not doing that. And he went a totally different direction.
Wow.
But it went all the way through his company.
I love that. I love what you're saying about finding the values. I think that's just so powerful. And, I'm just curious, and I don't know if I'm allowed to ask this, but what do you... Of
course you are. It's a conversation.
Yeah, what do you think so you just gave a really good example of that, but there's all these different ways that values show up. So what are some of the most important ways that you can find, the true values in an organization? Because not everyone they should hire a me or a Keith, but they're not all going to do that. So how can leaders find that? Is a really good question I ask.
Well, and that's the kind of the point I wanted to jump in on, because I think you've got to be kind of a cultural anthropologist in terms of really understanding, your culture. And I think that when you're within a culture for a while, that it's next to impossible to do that, to be able to analyze and to be objective about your current culture. So, again, this is why you would bring in a consultant or somebody from the outside that could ask the right questions, that has, a different worldview or paradigm that they look at the culture through, and be able to provide you objective feedback or alternative perspectives on a culture that just seems normal and natural, to you. So, for example, in my career, I served 4 really large congregations as a pastor, and I knew that the first 6 months were my best time to really learn the culture of the place. And what I mean by that is like, what are the values of this place? What are the real values? What do people talk about, kind of offline about this organization? How is conflict handled and dealt with in this organization? How are decisions made? What's the right process for decisions? In one church I was in, they wanted a formal proposal that they could vote up or down. Another church, they wanted to have a white paper that gave all the philosophical background of why you were making a decision, but don't give us the solution. Just outline the whole, kind of situation, and then we'll come up with that as leadership. Whereas in another congregation, it was the senior pastor and he made all the decisions. It was very, authoritarian in that way. Well, these are different kind of cultural aspects, of, the sign up front all said Presbyterian Church on them, but they were all very different culturally in terms of how they, they operated or worked. So, with that in mind, I think that it's, it's super important to kind of know and understand. And I always felt like part of my success, in my career has been that I took that time in those beginning months to really understand before I was implementing any change or leading people in a different direction. I needed to understand the context of where I was before I could move it, to another place organizationally. And like I said, once you've hit 6 months to a year in an organization, now you're an insider and you absolutely need somebody from the outside to come in and help, ask those questions and facilitate and guide those conversations going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting example because I think that first green period, of entering any kind of system, and some of that is what you're talking about is just a form of respect. So it's a high value of yours to show respect in that way. It also just happens to be a really smart business strategy. Because if you do that, or when you do that, you as a leader, you signal to people that their voice matters is one thing, but you also just find out all kinds of really big, fast track kinds of things that you can change that people then trust you because they feel like you listen. Oh, I told that guy we should do it this way. And look at this, he made the change, so now I trust him. You can't buy that.
Right. Well, and even just, to give you a shout out, Lisa, I know that your approach to consulting is you don't have a cookie cutter approach that applies to every single organization. It's that you really have to do that heavy, that digging, that deep digging to understand, and then come up with ideas and a direction that, help the organization to move to their desired future. And, and so, yeah, there's really is no cookie cutter approach. There is that basic respect. I think people sense that if you come in and have like your approach and your way of doing it, then, that's, they just feel like they're manipulated. But if they feel like they've been asked questions, brought into the process, and then you come up with recommendations that they then embrace, then there's so much respect in that and people are going to be on board and buy into it.
And I think that's the key crux of that with culture is that it's that thing that your employees care about almost more than anything else. So, but leaders in the executive suite want performance. So then oftentimes I'm brought in and there's this dual agenda, there's this, we need high performance and there's like a magic wand that this consultant brings to wave over the organization and then they will start performing.
There's not?
They're not trick dogs, I mean, even if you look at the people who train animals, the number one thing any one of them will say, and I'm not likening corporate culture to animals, but I am saying the number one thing is trust. And I don't think there's any substitute for that. You can feel it. And you said this, Pete, that you can feel it when you walk into a culture that has it versus one that doesn't. You can feel it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things I want to say about all of this stuff because there's just, I don't want to lose track of these moments, but this trust building. And then one of the things that I've said a lot and it makes people spit the bit, but gives me a chance to run my mouth again. So that's part of the reason why I say it, but especially in combat, it's all affect over effect. And if you're like, no, affect is a verb, like go look it up and then come back. And then I'll tell you that it's a response to stimuli. Yes, it can be a verb, but in this case, and I always use the example, like I can write you 15 love letters it doesn't mean you're going to love me. That's effect. And here's an example that happened on my flight out to Georgia. I get on my flight. I haven't flown since the pandemic started, and everything's done. Flight attendants, check everything, prepare for, takeoff. We're at that stage. Everything's done. And all of a sudden the lady walks up, flight attendant, and she looks over at me and she says, "Pete Turner?" And I said, "Oh yeah, that's me." And I'm thinking, oh crap, who's that? Because we're done, we're ready to go. And she said, "I just wanted to take a moment. You haven't flown with us for a while. I wanted to thank you for coming back and flying with Delta. It looks like it's been since March." And I had to I pulled my mouth shut. I'm like, you took the time, and she was genuine. She didn't go, "Delta would like to thank you." Like, it was a genuine thing. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how you measure that for a CEO, but that company just got more of I already like Delta, but if they screw something up, I'm going to balance the scale and be like, they also did this and they care about me. I mean, how valuable is that one thing, that affect driven action? And I'm a big believer, like in an organization has to do small, instant responses that are pervasive in the organization. So like a company said, "Pete, how do we do better with veterans?" I'm like, act like you care.
Yeah.
If a veteran resume comes in, it should get an immediate response. I see that it can be a robot. I see that you're a veteran and you've applied for a job. Someone will get back with you shortly. That instant response, and you better have someone follow up. But to get a null response, we already think you don't like us. You already have one strike against you, so start with that assumption in mind. That's like what Keith was talking about earlier. You already have this. This is your culture, whether you want it or not. That's where the veteran shows up with. Respond instantly and then follow up, and then boom, you're already doing a better job because you've taken this simple action.
And that's to the point you said earlier about ego and where does ego come into culture. And I think that it has, you act like you care, you said. Actually, putting aside ego means you do care.
Right.
And it's a very subtle distinction, but I think it's a good one to every leader should check themselves. Do I actually care? Mm-hmm. And I read somewhere, I think in the last week, some statistic that's, I believe it was 60 or 70% of people who are in management really don't want to manage people. And they're only doing it because, like, how else are you going to get up the corporate ladder and then grow your paycheck? In the corporate system, that's kind of the one pathway to do it. So you got a lot of people who are overseeing, the stewards of the company's teams and culture and performance, that they don't want to do the job they're doing. It's like, how do you get that ugly? You can't fix ugly,
Yeah. And how expensive is that? Once again, like, this stuff costs money. Why is CQ EQ's handmaiden? Like, why are we so obsessed with emotional intelligence? I would say, if anything, CQ is greater than EQ. Not that EQ is not important and not essential, but we refuse to accept that if you are good at CQ, you already have an EQ element in your, in your quiver.
So what do you think is culture intelligence? I want to hear it.
You put me on the spot now. Luckily I have an answer. It's cultural acuity. It's being able to go into any cultural setting and reliably come out with a path that works within the cultures blending together. So if I'm going to work overseas with an Indian contract provider, I am going to reliably be able to go out and find their path and figure out how to use their path to get my mission accomplished. So I'm going to look for signs of acuity results in this. I'm going to look for signs of my sense of passive aggressive behavior, corruption, just incompetence. If I hear those things in my head, I'm going to stop and say, I have a cultural problem I'm not doing properly, because I don't understand their decision-making process and I don't understand their goals, and they likely have the same thing towards me. And so we're incongruent. If you are able to do that and master that and be reliably good at it, you have high CQ.
Good. I like that. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Nice.
And you wrote the book.
Make sure we hire Lisa and Pete to go out and help you with your culture.
Right. I was just going to say, Pete, you're hired.
But people don't ever talk about that. You don't ever what you hear from people is like, yeah, I'm really good working overseas, And then literally this is an exact example. The next sentence, this is someone that Keith and I both know. This person works overseas or has in the past, said, "My Indian partner won't do what I tell him to do." And I'm like, oh my God, like you are absolutely screwing this up.
Yeah.
Like, I hear it.
Yeah. I mean, and I had a leader at a conference ask me one time, how do you build a unified global company culture? And I remember saying, don't.
Exactly. Don't. Please don't do that.
Because that comes back to that just respecting people's native culture. And there can be so I really like that you guys have both gone to the decision process, the communication processes, and the way that people are hired and promoted. Those are probably three of the biggest things I look at, the signals that I look at to see if those processes are, there's buy-in to those processes. And so those things can be unified to some extent. There can be these principles that you have. It's just really difficult to create a cookie cutter culture outside. Even teams within the same site will have a different cultural flavor to them and should. Tribes, I don't know, I think it's the Dunbar's Law. It believe that is the name of the law that just generally points to this anthropological evidence that if you get over 150 people, you really, that's the maximum number of people that you can have that can actually be unified and marching in a competition. Well, you've got these mega organizations of 150,000 people. There's no way to get everybody feeling like they're part of one culture in that.
You can't even.
And even America, which has a constitution and which has a set of cultural principles.
Yes.
We're not one culture. We're California and New York.
Right.
And there's a big difference having been in both.
I worked at Travelers, which has multi-tiered CEOs in this massive organization. And we had these mandatory phone calls where instead of working, you listen to somebody who you'd never met in your life, who couldn't pick you out of a crowd. And you would get a briefing from them as they went down the line. It was like, best year ever for Citigroup, best year ever for Travelers Insurance and Surety, best year ever from Travelers Bond, where I work, all CEOs, right? Each one of these guys. And then literally the next day I go into my vice president's office and he's like, "Well, Pete, we've had a rough year." Like, wait a second. Everybody else in the organization had this fantastic year. You just got a new car. How did I have a bad year?
Yeah.
This doesn't make any sense. Yeah. I thought we crushed our stretch goal. What happened? That incongruence, again, that's expensive.
Well, and I think, corporations and organizations, they're very well known for just kind of trying to put the spin on things that they want to have come down from the top, those corporate talking points, the way that they want the workforce and the members of the organization, the clients, everybody that's associated, to kind of to see. But what I found is like if people have their BS meter on and just see it as BS, then they're never gonna like actually believe like what's been told to them or fed to them, through those conference calls or those briefings or leadership letter or any other way that things are going to be communicated. I think that again, I go back to where I started with this whole thing. When you start with the values, and then when you find people that are living into those values, and then you kind of you fan the flame of those individuals or those units to kind of grow and to kind of take on a life of their own. So I don't know if I'm expressing this quite right, but let's say, like I would have never planned, Pete, in our youth group back, when you were a teenager, to say, we're going to have 20 kids come from Benicia, California, 20 miles away, to be involved in this youth group, but then, I basically kind of let you go. I mean, I fanned that flame of like, you're like, "Hey, can I bring my friends?" Yeah. Before I knew it, there was 20 kids that were coming from Benicia, the Benicia boys with you. Right. And, and of course, all the girls in the youth group had crushes on all of you.
Right.
But anyway,
more popular at home. Be like,
mainly of you, but,
knowing your mark.
But what I'm saying is that, but I allowed your personality to emerge and your personality to, to basically be a cultural element, in that group. It wasn't the whole group, but, I could have stifled that or communicated something different. But, this is something that emerged within the values that we had. And it's like, okay, this is really good. And this is adding so much to what this group, the whole group's experience is. I'm just going to keep fanning that flame and seeing that emerge. And I think the same thing could happen in other types of organizations. You get a certain unit that is kind of taking on a personality and a life of its own. Will fan that flame. If you're in multi-ethnic groups and there's in your example of, you got vendors and partners in, India, for example, and, how can your whole culture be enriched by just fanning the flame of those individuals and their perspective and what they bring to the table? So,
I had a good friend of mine who works for one of the largest enterprise software companies in the world. And they have offices all over the world. And they were going through the conversion in their software development process from waterfall to agile, which just is a way of, I talk about cultural agility really as a way of understanding that you need to have shorter cycles of implementation on anything you're doing so that you can have quicker change. And agile is a body of work that is centered around the ability to be very dynamic and customer focused. So they were making this. And this is really funny. She relates this story, and my jaw just drops when I hear these kind of things. She goes, yeah, we went about it the way we go about everything. We did the whole big, huge rollout. We got global teams together. We brought in a really fancy consultant, trained them all in this whole new methodology, hired an internal culture team that went around and did what you talked about, Pete, finding the culture, right? And got massive amount of feedback about how we don't trust our leaders here. We're never going to be able to make this change. It's never going to work. Meanwhile, they're launching teams across the globe. These are Scrum teams, they're called. And so now here I am in Colorado, have colleagues in India. I have colleagues in South America. I have colleagues in Philippines. And we're all supposed to get on Zoom at the same time and have these Scrum meetings. Well, that lends itself to what we're in person, right? But you and the three of us are on time zones that are about an hour or two apart. These people were getting up in the middle of the night at midnight to go have meetings. So there was all this craziness. And she said, we just went about it the way we do everything. We just dive into the pool and then figure out whether we know how to swim.
Yeah.
Millions of dollars were spent, and they canned the entire initiative in a year and fired the head of IT. I mean, and that just sent this whole, and then we're back to what? What are we doing now? How are we developing our software? It's just, and this goes on all the time. And so to me, the culture is just, it's like you were saying, it's almost like it's an effect of that type of leadership or that type of decision-making process or that kind of communication or how we hire people and fire them. It's an effect. It's not something that you actually construct, as you pointed out at the very beginning. I've been rambling on a little bit too long.
This is great. One of the biggest times I ever used culture to my advantage was, and it took a long time to develop this ability to do this, but I sat down with an Afghan leader who was, from our point of view, tied to the Taliban, a bad guy, and, wouldn't go out to his district and govern it. And he started teaching me, because I learned to shut up and listen and try to understand things from his perspective and not do anything until he's like, I'm desperate for your help, Pete. Can you do this teeny tiny little thing? Then I'm like, I'd poke my head out and be like, oh, this one little thing? Sure. Or better, let me get your partner, because I wasn't even the direct partner. And so I sat down with him and I said, hey, Zarif was his name. Zarif, like, you're the governor of this district, the county, right? You're the governor of this county. We're trying to make the government work. You understand? And we'd finally built 6 months it took to build trust with this guy. And I said, what do you want to do? Like, what's your plan? Do you even think that way? And he's like, of course I think that way in plans. And I'm like, can I record it? Would you let me try to understand it? And he said, yeah. Okay. And he's like, how do you want me to explain it? I'm like, tell me what order you want to do things in, and tell me what provisions that you have or should be able to get through your government and how to get those. And then where do you need our help? And so I made this whole PowerPoint slide to reflect that, right? Took all the notes. And granted, this is cross language, but that's fine. I'm good with that stuff. So I go in and I build this thing perfectly, but I'm like, I have to test this thing. So I scrambled it all up and I screwed it up like how a young private would do. And I handed it back to him and he said, no, damn it. Here. And he started changing it back to what I had, which was his plan. And there are sub elements within that. That's a longer story. So I took this plan because I knew I had to do this. For one, I had to check myself. Two, I had to check up the Army because I knew their culture. So I came back and I said, here is the governor's plan. Literally, no one has ever asked them for what they want to do as we try to legitimize the government. I've talked to the people in the villages. They don't think the government ever does anything for them. Here is a potential path. This is a potential small win. So I hand it to them, and they're like, there's no way on earth this guy made this PowerPoint slide. And I'm like, yeah, dummy, he didn't. I did. But I talked to him for hours, and they're like, there's no way this is his plan. And like I told them the story. I'm like, I screwed it all up. He came back. He corrected it. This is his plan. And he doesn't need much from us. And that totally changed. By the time I got done getting the Army to calm down and listen, it totally changed how they approached it. And they're like, okay, we're going to do less. We were burning trash. Like all of our supplies would be flown in from a plane. They would drop it in via parachute. So we had all these cardboard boxes and these parachutes. We were burning all this cardboard and parachutes. And he's like, that stuff's valuable to me. I can govern with that. I can't get my government to give me anything. In the meantime, can I have your parachutes? Can I have your cardboard and anything you guys don't need, because I can turn that into political capital for me. Think about that win. That took 6 months and a ton of experience leading up to that 6 months to be able to sit down and be able to not only understand what he did, but also communicate it to the Army in a way that made sense.
I mean, you said do nothing. I think that's probably some of the very best advice that leaders won't listen to.
Yeah. How would you accomplish this, young Pete? You think you could bring friends here? How would you do that? You know? And then Pete will go, I'll just ask them and I'll bring them and I'm ravenous and I want my friends to like me what I do. I'm just going to keep, like, how would you do this was a big question. I started asking, what would be appropriate here? How do you safely get this done in a place that's hyper dangerous? And they would say, I would do it this way. I'm like, then I want to do it in that model right there.
Yep. Yeah. That's the killer app. For corporate right there. Just go out and start asking questions. But I think that we have, and it'll be interesting actually to see what happens when you begin to see millennials in power in corporate, because they will, I think, change the rules. But our generation, which is largely still in power in corporate America, especially, not so much the entrepreneurial community, has, I think, a really different way of viewing what the job of leadership is. So our generation viewed it as, I'm supposed to have the answers. And by God, if somebody asks me, for the report or for the recommendation or it's my job to spill out the answer. And that just creates so much vulnerability in terms of, you see all these people with these holding their cards very close, but also these really false hope that they're standing on because they don't have the answer. They're the people that they haven't asked have it, right?
They don't have the freedom to say, I don't know.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. If you say, I don't know, that's actually a career limiting move.
And there are so many ways to get the job done. That's another thing I learned. Like, wait, you would do it this way and that works here?
Yeah.
All right, let's try your way. And what do you need from me? I don't need anything. It's just going to get done. I don't have to do anything. You're going to do it and compel your people to do this, and I'm going to get what I want. Instead of, my commander says they intend for you to do it this way. Like, dude, if you ever say my commander wants again, I'm going to tell him you said that.
Yeah.
Like, stop saying that. My boss wants it done this way. Okay, great. But how would this guy do it? And then can you get the same result, like getting it done? It's not comfortable, but it is the better way to do it.
I mean, Pete, I don't think change should be comfortable. It's by definition supposed to make you uncomfortable. And I think if there was one mantra that every organization should adopt, it is, let's try it. Let's just try it. Because you hear this articles being written, Harvard Business Review and all these magazines right now about needing innovation. You mean innovation is another one of those things like culture. It's this thing that comes, it's an effect that comes out of the behavior called, let's try this. Right. See if it works, and I don't know if you guys remember this story. There's a famous story about Thomas Watson Sr. when he was at the helm of IBM, and he had a lieutenant in his leadership team that had made a gigantic mistake that cost the company $1 million, which in today's terms would probably be about 20 times that. And the guy comes into gets called into Thomas Watson's office, and he's like, ready to be fired, standing there. The guy, Watson looks at him and goes, I just invested $1 million in your development. You think I'm firing you now? That's the spirit.
Yeah, I want everybody. This is Lisa's book right here. It's really incredible. I've been thumbing through it, and look, her and Jerry wrote this thing, and there's so much of what I already know and believe in there. So, I mean, I can definitely give it my full endorsement. And it's fun to read books when you're like, yes, 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 yes. So it was a treat to thumb through it and
awesome.
Be able to have these kind of conversations because, again, we were talking on the phone the other day when I was in Georgia, and I use my example, like culture is like gravity, like it's everywhere.
I love that. Yeah.
It gets its take no matter what you do.
Exactly. You can believe in it or not believe in it. It's still working.
Yeah. It don't care. It just keeps going. And you can't explain it away. It's so you can choose to ignore it. You can choose to focus on EQ or whatever, but CQ, it's a hugely valuable thing. Culture's pretty simple if you allow it to exist and understand that it's there. And instead of having it be collisions, you create, we talked about this too, you create an intersection so that there's cues and clues. You're like, these guys are going to go by at 80 miles an hour. I'm going to let them go by and then I'm going to go. Like you have to navigate it in a way that is patient. It's deliberate work, but it is the critical path though.
It's absolutely true. And I love that metaphor of the intersections because without those cues and without some of those ground rules or there's agreements that everybody sort of abides by, you're just going to have a lot of collisions. So you can boil it down to some things that, are core truths in your team or in your organization about how we work together that actually are like magic. And one of them, in my opinion, Keith spoke about at the very beginning, which is making it fun.
I love fun.
Yeah.
We had so much fun.
Stick around the campus. I mean, come on.
And I think, my kind of add on to that is that, it's like when the preferred culture emerges, it. And then I think where Pete's going with his comment here is that culture endures. This youth group in Walnut Creek, California was, in the mid 1980s. I mean, and the kids in the youth group are now all in their 50s, right? Yeah. And yet, every year, like that's gone by, even up to this year, I will talk to 10 or 15 of the kids in the youth group, and just like how meaningful that group, that culture, that experience was, lifelong relationships, lifelong memories, lifelong impact, by getting it right. So, I think that there's huge upside rewards that more than just the quarterly profit reports or, launching a new product. It's definitely what if this is a culture that emerges that is right, then it has lasting impact, for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. Which works the other way too.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You build a culture that's stuck and you're with it for a while because it's really I've often said it's just easier to blow it up and start over.
Yeah. I have a friend that works for a corporation, a national corporation, and this person is in a situation where they interact with the public, both clients and just walk-up people and everything. And because they live in an area with a lot of homeless, it's a lot of homeless activity around too and everything. And this person is terrified that something is going to happen to them, because they're alone. There's not really any other staff there, and she brings this up to the corporate headquarters. And this person kills it at their job. They're all of their metrics are great. They're They're performing at as good as any other location can perform. And the corporation basically does nothing to ensure this person feels safe in a dangerous environment. They don't get, this person meets metrics where they get rewards from the company, and this person doesn't consume those rewards. And the company's just like, hey, that's great. We didn't spend money on that or whatever. And I hear that, and I'm just like, I wish someone would just go over there and shake the CEO and say, can I tell you what's happening at your company? But I would never want to harm my friend. That's why I'm very protective of this person's identity, gender, where they live, all these things, because I don't want anybody to know. But it's shocking to me how, if something was to happen to this person physically, which is, no one could rule that out because of where they work and what they have to do. And their job is not a dangerous job, by the way. It's a forward-facing corporate job. It would be, if this person survived this attack, it would be millions of dollars of this in such a preventable thing. What is it about companies that makes them afraid to create a feeling of safety? And I'm not saying be paralyzed by fear, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about someone who's on their own and never accepts the accolades and the rewards that they get because they're so disaffected.
Well, I think there's two things. I mean, I can answer that straight up. And one of them is HR. Sorry if you're on HR and you're listening to this, because human resources is a compliance-based function historically, organizationally, and they don't necessarily are not fully rewarded for the compassionate policy making that you just described. And the second thing, I think, you pointed to the airplane example earlier, and I'm going to use it as a metaphor. If you're a CEO, you're flying at 30,000 feet. You really don't know what's happening on the ground, so you rely on your ground troops to tell you. And as we've pointed out, there are not safety mechanisms in place for that communication to go up the chain. So I've been in boardrooms where people are making decisions where I don't think they're uncaring humans. They're just pretty much like all of us, they do care, but they don't have the line of sight to who they're caring for and what the needs are of those people. So you put those two kind of dynamics together, and I think it explains a lot of it. I don't think that most people, and then you've got just a whole lot of people in frontline management that don't want to be there. So it's a combustion. Yeah. In that situation of why that happens organizationally. But the smaller you can maintain that 150 Dunbar's number, I think, in terms of tribes. I've known companies, do you know the company, and I don't know if they're still doing this, that has the home advisor, right? So you can go online and find yourself a person to do whatever chores around the house you don't want to do or don't know how to do. And they started exploding in terms of growth. They bought Angie's List. They went through this massive expansion. And they literally, here in Colorado, their headquarters are here in Colorado, they started breaking up the company once they got past that 150. They literally opened a brand new office, and that office has a whole different culture, and one of them is downtown and has a lot of kids and has a really cool culture. And one of them has a little more family culture, so there's, I think, a lot of things that companies can do that are very much are architectural and design oriented to make the conditions for the effect called culture the best that it can be.
Let me ask you a hard question. So, yeah.
Yes.
You're in a company like this, you're listening to the Break It Down show, and you're like, are they talking about me? And we're not talking about you. But how do they create this change? Because you and I both know if we call the CEO and say, I have really good news, I can help you with your cultural problem, they don't call back. It's really hard to sell the bad news that we bring. Because we look under the hood and we're like, hey, all these problems you don't know you're having, here's what they look like. And then people lose their minds and they don't want to cut a check because, I didn't need you 2 days ago. I don't need you now.
Yeah, no, that's so real. And I've never been inside an organization literally engaged where the CEO wasn't driving it because of that, where the CEO didn't either get that intelligence somewhere. And usually, Gary and I have talked about this for years, that comes from having failed massively at some massive change implementation. So they were part of a merger, they were part of a turnaround, it didn't work. They knew culture was the reason, they're going to get out in front of it. But yeah, how do you go about it? If you're trying to do it yourself, it's what you said at the beginning. I don't think it's the easiest thing that you could sign up to do. But you could start with your own team and creating some practices, and some of them are in my book. And I've got a website, by the way. I wanted to just mention this. That's I created this magazine because exactly what you're talking about, Pete. I wanted to share stories of successful cultural implementation because it does have that mystique. CEO says, we're doing the culture change. And we have walked into those organizations, sat in the executive room. You look around the table and you know that 80% of the people sitting here think it's just hooey. The other 20% don't know what it is. So because it has that mystique about it, you do have to make it concrete. And our work has always been about driving high performance in companies as the outcome of doing the culture work. And I think that you've got to marry those two things. I mean, businesses are in business to make money. So somehow you've got to point it at that. And when you're talking about the military, even any of those outcomes that leaders are held accountable for, you've got to link the culture work to them, for sure.
And I'm putting a link for the magazine in the show notes right now. So this will be up here in a second.
Yes. I want to hear from there are listeners that have a good story to tell or have a good tool to offer. I'm doing some version of what you're doing, which is doing Zoom interviews so that we can share these stories, put them into the magazine. So it's appreciated that you're doing that, because I think we all need to unveil the mystique about what this culture thing is, like gravity.
It is. And we could do these stories all day long. I'll do a real quick one. A friend of mine works at a refining place, and every few years they have to turn down part of the they call it a turnaround, a part of the refinery. And every year on the little list of things they do is like, we have to get that one crane that costs $10,000 a day. And every year there's a change in the plan because they won't change the plan. And so my friend's like, if they gave enough to care about me, I would tell them to not get that crane until 2 weeks from now, because every year we have to rebuild this element of the job. And so the crane sits there and costs, and it's just $250,000. Who cares, right? But it's $250,000 that they refuse to save. I could go out and find $1 million in that place right now because of that, the what I call the spaceship is not communicating with the ground. Here's another illustration of that.
Yep.
I was in a Afghan army area, and I was in the army staff room, and they were talking about things, and they knew that I'd been out and about, and there was a bit of a test for me. And so this very senior State Department person said, "Hey, Pete, what TV channels do they watch in that valley to see, if I knew my stuff?" And it was great. I got to say, "Dennis, they don't have electricity in that valley." And it completely changed the paradigm in that room because they didn't know the ground truth. You're worried about TV stations. You're challenging me. Turns out, you need more of me out there to give you the reality of what's going on. You can't. How are you going to make these decisions? You're not in a vacuum. You're in a spaceship inside of the vacuum in a different place, nowhere near the reality where the work. If you can't identify where the work is, you got a big problem. And it's a culture
level, right? I agree with you. I think if you're in the business of doing culture, so many of the people that are doing it are calling it like, you're going to feel better, you're going to engage your employees, you're going to have, they're kind of pitching it around this soft side of the business. But in the end, I can walk around an organization of almost any size and find at least $1 million that's left on the table because of the way you're treating your people and the way that you're making decisions, the way you're communicating, the way that you're hiring and promoting.
One of my favorite questions whenever I get hired to do this kind of work is to sit down with the person who's doing the job that nobody, it's just thankless, like outbound calls, right? Whatever. Yeah. What's next for you with this company? And it's a game changer. I don't start with that, but I get there and then they laugh. And if they laugh, I'm like, no, you don't have to say anything else. And just write down, they laughed. And then you bring that to the CEO. You're like, and the other thing I always ask them when I get the opportunity, which is never often enough, I'll ask the CEO, are you guys great at training people? The answer to that question is always yes. Yes, of course. We find the best people, we train them, we're great at it. Would it be helpful to see the people that have not left this company and are now in senior positions at other places? And they're like, yes, I would. Are we letting that much talent get away? I'm like, I don't know, but would it be helpful? And it's always yes, because you do try to have, if you have this state-of-the-art training program and hiring system, why are you bleeding vice presidents and director of this type people? Why aren't you getting those people into your organization to help you? that. Come on, Lisa, how expensive is that?
At that level, 5 times salary and benefits to replace somebody like that.
Mhm.
Because a lot of those folks don't work out, because you bring somebody in at that higher level. So true. And I know a lot of organizations, I think this is kind of cool. I don't think it's widespread yet, but you're starting to see a movement around alumni clubs of people who've left the company, and then you kind of have some form of social connection that you keep to the organization in case you want to come back. Because it used to be if you left, that was betrayal. Right? If you quit and went to a competitor. But now you're seeing, I think, companies getting a lot more realistic too about that because of what you just said. You just walked out the door, walked a huge amount of the competitive intelligence and advantage for your business, and they're taking it to your competitor. How
does someone get into this line of work? I mean, you don't pick cultural consultant when you're 17 years old about to graduate high school.
No, no, but you know what? I always had a curiosity about people. So I think that was sort of the seed that was planted in me pretty early. I was always that girl who would sit and listen more than I would talk, which even being here today is a little uncomfortable for me because I would rather listen to your stories.
I thought we were talking too much over you.
Yeah.
No, but I did. Here's how it came about that we became culture experts. We were working inside, I can even say this, at Merck. We were doing a program that was their flagship leadership development program. And it was, of all things, a 3-day training class on how to run effective meetings that facilitate effective meetings that had full engagement of the people in the room. And people would come in at the vice president level and they'd be like, why are we having to sit through a 3-day training on meetings, right? And by the end of it, of course, they were completely singing a different tune. But after we did inside Merck, a couple of sites where we did a full-scale implementation of that particular training class, they started saying this is changing our culture. And that's what got me to understand meetings are really the arena or playing field for culture. It's the place where people come together, right? And how those are conducted and run has a huge impact on on shaping and having the effect that you want to have in the culture. So we branded as Corporate Culture Pros. We thought, well, listen to the customer. Yeah. They're telling us that's what it's doing. Let's just go figure this out, how to make it more intentional. Yeah, it was 2003, I think, that we did that. Yeah. And it was also kind of an interesting thing that I didn't think that you could find business on the internet. I'm just being really transparent. So we built a whole website and did search engine optimization, and we were busy for years and years and years off of that. I mean, I still get leads today off of, it just surprises me because usually you would think this is the kind of thing where, but you know what it is? CEOs especially and top leaders, they don't necessarily want to go out and say to their colleague, do you need a culture expert? It's like saying, do you want to meet my therapist? So you have to be a little crafty.
Or have a colonoscopy.
I pooped in an envelope the other day. You don't have to get a colonoscopy anymore. You can just poop in a box or an envelope. It's great.
I have a version of that. It's called my Culture Builder Toolkit. You just go poop in a box, right?
Yeah, I got my poop in a box. No, that's fantastic. And I love hearing that because I didn't know. I mean, look, you look back and you see the thread, right? Like Keith said, I'm be 51 in about a month. And it all makes sense in the rearview mirror. But right. To get to where I got to, I had to have a high tolerance for uncertainty, obviously a high tolerance for danger, and then just a powerful curiosity. And then I became, because I deployed enough, I became a master at question asking, And my primary question is just to say something like, what keeps you up at night? Mm-hmm. And then just sit back and let them fill the space. And that stuff is gold to a CEO. And you're 100% right. If the CEO, if the commander, if the person isn't on board, if they're not providing top cover, because it's going to hurt when I bring my knowledge in. You're going to be like, this is going to sting. You can take it though, because it's not liking it and having it hurt does not mean it doesn't exist. We can work on this problem, but if you let the staff kill me, then you won't succeed.
I mean, and I have this gift. I put myself through college typing legal briefs in the days before transcription services and artificial intelligence did that, right? And so I would interview people or take the dictation kind of, and I learned how to type about as fast as a person can talk because I was lazy. I didn't want to have to rewind. So I just learned to type really, really fast. So when I do my interviews, I can type verbatim what they're saying. I don't have to remember it, and I use their words. And so then I'll put this report together, 52 pages of what they're saying, and I deliver that to the CEO, usually over a weekend. And it's like, oh, dagger in the heart, to read, this is what your people are feeling, and that always gets them because those answers wouldn't be coming. Right. To them directly, even if they were the kind of CEO that asked and listened, unless you've just done that repeatedly over and over again. So it's a valuable insight to have that kind of intelligence, that internal view of what people are really thinking. And usually what you find, and I don't know, Pete, if you found this, I know, Keith, you've had the same experience, you'll find that it's kind of incredible when you interview 50 or 100 people over the organization and you hear the same thing over and over again.
And that question, because I would do a lot of that too, because it was translated, I would have time to write as verbatim as you can when you're doing a translation. But you would hear my question pattern in this. And I would a lot of times just cut and paste that into the thing so you can see that I didn't load this question up. Like when we point at the government building and we say, what goes on there? And the farmer laughs and says that guy owes you money for a goat. The commander wants to know, like, wait a second. Like they laughed at the government building. I thought we were building a government. And this is 12, 15 years into this fight, as the boss, you're like, we haven't gotten past laughing at the government yet, and it's like, I love when they laugh. I love it because it's like preposterous to them, and then sometimes I'll be snarky and I'll put a note in there, like Pete's note. They think this is preposterous. Just to like set it in there because
the consultant's recommendation.
And I use these stories because they aren't abnormal or rare at all in organizations. Like you have these beliefs in mind. I would watch, like kind of like Keith, I would go to the unit and see how they communicated and go, okay, I know what your mission is because, it's written on the wall. And I see how you're communicating, and there's a lot of assumptions as to what's happening. So let me just go test these assumptions. And I already know that in 3 weeks, they'll be like, who the hell is this new guy? And why is he giving us all this bad news? And then the next thing you know, I'm talking to the commander directly. And I would tell him, in 3 weeks, you'll get it. And in 3 months, I'll be the most valuable asset you'll have. You'll look at me and you'll tell me that. You don't have to have that conversation because we just had it right now. You'll look at me, I'll look at you, and it'll be done. And they'll be like, okay, I'll take you up on that. And then 3 months later, the guy would look at me and be like, you want to sit on the couch anytime you want to talk? It's like, that's how powerful a cultural expert can be, though.
Right. I think a lot of times the cultural expert is actually inside the organization. I have found in my consulting work and in my leadership roles within culture is that, there are a few people within the organization that have it totally dialed in. And so like, I'm not making up my report or my assessment at the end of the day, out of thin air. It's like really being fed back to me by, again, listening and finding those key people that are going to really tell me how it is and not be afraid to speak that. So, one story that I've often told, back when I was in college, my parents were at Disneyland, staying in Anaheim. And they were like, we want to go check out the Crystal Cathedral. So they showed up at 8 p.m. Everything was closed. And there was one custodian at the Crystal Cathedral who proceeded to take them on a 2-hour insider's cook's tour of the entire Crystal Cathedral, the staff office buildings, Dr. Schuler's study, and all while providing commentary on the political issues going on in the church and opinions on different people's influence and impact and what the strategic plans were. And this was a custodian, at 9 o'clock at night in an empty campus, and just giving them the full, all the dirt and all the good stuff too, but everything. And so, I literally, Pete, the church that we met I was offered the job. I literally went over one evening before I accepted the job, and I hung out with Ernie, the custodian, who did the exact same thing for me, told me everything that was happening there before I said yes to that job. And I've done that with some kind of form of, kind of line level worker, not at the higher echelons, because I'm getting the leadership picture at the top, but how's this really playing out, with people that are more some of the lower rungs of the organization, and they'll tell you exactly the truth. And it's like, okay, will you accept this? Will you factor this in terms of like where you're going to go with this whole thing? So,
I love that story.
Amen.
I think my mom told me, she's like, so don't ever accept a job at a church without going and talking to the custodian first.
Yeah.
Because then you're going to get the real picture.
It's such an important thing to talk to those folks that are often invisible, because they hear and they see everything. They're so powerful.
Yeah.
We would do these quarterly assessments in Afghanistan to see how we were doing, all internal, right? And I learned to ask these great questions. And so we'd all sit down. It's a classified meeting. We're going to talk about the Afghan government and how great it's doing. And I'd raise my hand. Is this the kind of meeting we can actually contribute to, or should I just sit back and listen? Nice and loaded. And they're like, no, of course, you should contribute. Where are the Afghans? This is a classified meeting. Yeah, but we're analyzing their government and how we're doing. Why aren't they here? Why don't we declassify the meeting? And they're like, no, that's not the kind of meeting this is. And I'm like, I raise my hand again. Why not?
How many times were you demoted, Pete?
I got kicked off of camps all the time. That's why I learned I'd have the commander's support. And I would tell the commander, they're going to kick me off of camps because I'm going to do things like say, why not?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would get these responses in email, like, you're wrong. I'm like, no, you can argue with my analysis, but not with my observation. I actually saw this. I actually saw you roll your eyes at a guy who we call governor and dismiss him in front of his peers. And then I saw that governor go and leave the tent and go to his escape on the American camp and play video games to cool off because he wanted to kill you. I actually saw that. I didn't write that in the report, but this is not in any way rare. I mean, this happens in corporations all the time. I was, we had a high call sales job, like goal always going up, super high stress. And they're like, hey, you have to go to this training. It's a whole day. And I'm like, but my job is to be on the phone. You got to go to this inclusion training. And so I went to inclusion training the whole damn day and walked out feeling more excluded and knew that I was never going to blast at that company. That's what that. And the CEO would love to know, like, I just taught a guy that he doesn't belong here. It was like, it was all me. It's on you to be included. And I'm like, I'm working my heart out here, struggling, drowning.
Yeah.
And these things, they happen all the time. It's those folks on the ground, Keith, like you said, they have all the knowledge.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think also that if you can see sometimes even in organizations where you've got pockets of that happening that are really amazing and that producing an amazing result. And I know that there's an example of an organization that is in the mining industry, which is heavily safety oriented. Okay, so I know there's aspects around military that are like that as well. And they were, what was the consultant's phrase? We're lucky, not good, that we haven't killed anybody. We haven't killed anybody because we're lucky, not because we're good. Yes. And so they implemented a whole entire program around psychological safety. And it took some real doing to get these like tough miner supervisor type people to embrace the idea that you're going to create psychological safety in humans, and it's like, what? We got to just have we have to have job site safety.
Yeah.
What is another hooey up here in the mine? And they did it, and they haven't had an incident in 5 years, not even an incident. And so there's power in people feeling like they are part of a tribe and feeling cared for. There's a lot of power in it that produces real business outcomes, Yeah,
this goes back to Keith's organizational cultural example earlier. I've been in Army units where their motto is there's always time for safety. But do they mean, there's always time for safety? Or do they mean, it's always time? And then, because those create different responses to danger. Like we will not act, we will always act towards safety, you know, so you have to be in the middle somewhere. Yes, there's always time for safety. However, in this case, we're going to not do the safe thing because we have to do this action to get the mission done, you know? And then the other ones were like, and they're like, you guys are absolutely out of control. And, you know, and then organizationally, you've got to work within that as, you know, someone like me who's like, you guys are doing these actions. Someone's going to die 2 units ago, same pattern, same path. And you got to talk to the right person organizationally, and then they need to tighten up. But again, that's got to come externally. It doesn't hardly ever work externally.
Right. It doesn't bubble up from inside the ego of the person who's running the show. Yeah. You know, and that one, I think that's a really good example also of the power of culture, because once you know, create that, say, team or that pod or that group of people that are practicing these unfamiliar skills, and they're all rolling their eyes at first, and they're, you know, just sitting. I mean, they literally I asked him, I said, how did you do it? He goes, we put them all in a room together, and we had them share stories of how they grew up, and had them share stories of their family, and had them share stories about each other. You just made them care for one another. Right. And once that happened, and then you kind of taught them some of the tools of how to communicate, how to handle when you see somebody doing something that you know is not safe. Right. Because normally you would just kind of like, I'm just going to look the other way. I'm not going to notice that that's happened. You know, hopefully it works out for that person. But they would literally call that stuff out because now I care about you. I don't want you to die. Get off that ladder. You know, so I think that.
I'm going to flap my mouth some more here because this, I want to really heighten these points because it's so important. You know, one of the things I had to learn how to do was how to communicate with commanders. And then the sergeant majors were killing me because I'm a guy who doesn't look like them, doesn't act like them, but I am them, right? And so I'm like, I got to figure out how to get these guys in my mind. And they're desperately concerned about safety. And so I would come to them proactively and say, you know, day to day, you're not going to need much of my help because I'm focused on commander type things. However, because I go on a lot of missions throughout the unit and throughout the area, I will see when these guys aren't doing things right. And I've been in every kind of unit. So I know, like, if they're not strapping things down, you know, if they're doing things that I know aren't safe, that kind of thing, I don't want to call them out directly because that will compromise my integrity with them. But I do want to know, can I bring that stuff to you? Are you interested in that? But you can't let anybody know. And they're like, yes, they were desperate to know this stuff, you know? So I would say like, hey, this unit has ammo boxes all on the back of their, you know, their truck where we're all sitting, and anything happens, that ammo goes flying everywhere. It's super dangerous. And they would be able to then lead in their own way to create the safety. And then those guys became invaluable to me because someone would try to cut my neck in a staff room. I wouldn't even be in there. And they'd be like, you better leave that guy alone. You know, and they would come tell me like so-and-so tried to kill you today.
Yeah.
And I was like, golly, look at that. You know, you have to have these advocates throughout the organization to create this cultural change of, you know, whatever it is.
Champions, culture champions of some kind. They're willing to sort of hold up the mirror. Yeah, to that. And that example too is, I think I don't know, Pete, you know, did they know your intent? You know, because sometimes that speaks louder than, but I think there's just so much fear of being shamed about this. I don't know the answer, or I got called out for doing something wrong, that almost trumps the intent.
Yeah. The boy, intent. I could go on all day about intent. Let's plug what you're doing so everybody can kind of go out and check out the work. And if you are in the world of culture, or you think you might have a cultural problem at your company, well, first off, you can always get the book. That's a great example. But what else do you want to plug, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you are having a culture problem, you probably need what we've been talking about, which is a cultural assessment. We do perform those at Culture Pros. Would love to hear from you. And I'm also that kind of person that will just get on the phone with anybody and just talk to them about what's going on in their organization. And usually even with, 30 minutes, you're going to walk away with some kind of insight. It's not about necessarily hiring us, but would love to have that conversation. And you can reach me at lisa@corporateculturepros.com or on LinkedIn. I think it's up there on the show notes.
It was, yeah.
I love to talk about this stuff, as you can tell, all day long. So I'm really, really pleased to have been able to do that here in this kind of conversational way. Keith and Pete, you guys just drew out so many amazing points about culture that I wouldn't have even thought of.
And I would just say, just to add to what you just said, Lisa, is that you are producing this quarterly magazine on corporate culture as well. And so
Attraction Culture Magazine is designed to share stories of how we can produce cultures that attract and retain great talent. And I am looking for stories, great stories. These are not my articles, although I'll write one or two for the magazine, but definitely looking at the opportunity to hear stories. So reach out to me if you've got one.
Right. And people can subscribe to that through your website as well, or through the link that's on the screen. And I would say the other thing that before COVID hit, you were doing a lot of keynote speaking for leadership meetings at different companies. And I know, that's kept you off the airplane the last 8 or 9 months. But you're finding some traction around doing keynotes in this virtual type environment. And then hopefully in 6 to 8 months, you could be back on the road again to do more of those conferences that you were doing before. So, I would just, say to listeners out there that this is another way to engage Lisa and her, broad knowledge and expertise in this area within your company or organization.
Absolutely. Thank you, Keith.
Oh, no. Our pleasure to have you on. Keith, anything else for you in closing?
No, great. It's great to be on, Pete. And thank you for making this just so conversational and fun and inspiring. And just grateful for the work that you're doing, just to be kind of a public forum for just some great ideas around, general trends in our culture, and whether it's in the area of music or what's happening in business, or just things in the arena of politics. You're doing a great job with all this, and just grateful to be a part of it.
Oh, thanks, everybody.
Likewise.
All right.